This evening, it's a real pleasure for me to welcome Elizabeth Lev. She is a fellow, a permanent fellow, research fellow of the Center for Ethics and Culture. She's an American-born art historian living and working in Rome since 1997. She's been teaching art history at Duquesne University since 2001, briefly taught Renaissance art at John Cabot University for 5 years, and is currently on the teaching staff at the Pontifical University of the Angelicum in Rome, as well as at Christendom College. She's the author of 3 books: The Tigress of Forli, Renaissance Italy's Most Courageous and Notorious Countess; Roman Pilgrimage, The Station Churches with George Weigel; and A Body for Glory, Theology of the Body in the Papal Collections with Father Jose Granados. She presented a TED Talk on the unheard story of the Sistine Chapel and has appeared on a number of television and radio shows, including ABC's Nightline and The Today Show. Liz will be speaking tonight on the gifts of the Magi, the Catholic imagination, and the birth of the modern museum. Please join me in welcoming my friend Liz Lev.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here. And I see a lot of my former students and old friends, so some of this is going to be a little familiar to you. But really, I'm very excited to be able to come here and talk to you about something that my favorite place, basically. And so I was thinking about how this whole talk came about. And it came about when years and years ago, I started doing tours of the Vatican museums. And back in the day, everything was open. There were no ropes, there were no closed doors, there were no closed-off galleries. So I'd take these little groups of people, and we would go up the Bramante stair, and we'd go into the Etruscan Gold Museum, we'd go into the Nicolene Chapel, we'd go into the micro-mosaic room, and hours and hours later, back in the day when I had more stamina and people had more patience, hours and hours and hours later, people were kind of standing there dazed, but everybody was so happy because we had seen so much of the museums. It felt like a candy store, the Vatican museums. And so that was the great joy, going to work every day, watching that expression on people's faces, almost drunk on art, until one day someone said, "So, who did the Pope have to rape and pillage to put all this stuff together?" And I have found over the course of the years, and especially doing an awful lot of tours, that it's sometimes exactly that kind of question, the one that seems the most obnoxious, is the one that ends up bearing the greatest fruit. And really, the talk is the result of the question, that asking myself that question. Instead of asking what it was we were looking at, how did all of these things end up in this one place? And it ended up being probably the most exciting and the most interesting discovery of all, to find out that the Vatican museums are the fruit of half a millennium of Catholic imagination, that it was something put together over a sustained series of visions by 3 different popes that gave us what is essentially the world's first modern museum. And so with this, I'm going to start to introduce to you a little bit about just the time and structure, the way I wanted to do this. I want to look at 3 aspects of the Catholic imagination. And and with it, the 3 popes that made their contributions, the gifts of the Magi, as it were. They will give, over a distance of centuries, a series of different gifts that help the museums be put together. And it was this imagination that transformed a very good art collection belonging to a well-connected cardinal into what was essentially going to be museums as you and I know it today. Not only is it the first modern museum, but when other museums, like the Louvre and the British Museum, eventually start to think in terms of organizing a collection, you'll find they're looking at the Vatican Museum. So the first person we'll be talking about is Pope Julius the Second. And he's Julius II della Rovere. He applied what you might describe as a redemptive imagination to the works of the past, and he encouraged the artists who worked for him to do the same. They were to rechristen pagan beauty for Christian and sacred glory. The second, who was Pope Pius VI Braschi, imagined an overarching Christian narrative active even in the world of the pagan Greece and pagan Rome, and he reordered the museum into a collection that would illustrate that vision. The last figure, Pius XI Ratti, even as the geographical space of the Vatican was diminishing, he started to think in terms of a community, a community that would be brought together through art and beauty that would stretch across the globe. Despite fits and starts, naysayers and looters, the Vatican Museums became the model for the world's most successful museums and remains the Catholic Church's calling card to this day. So let's start with our first pope. On October 31st, 1503, Julius the Second, or Giuliano della Rovere, was elected pope in the shortest conclave in history. His decision not to change his name, but to keep a name on one hand of a sainted pope, but on the other hand of an infamous dictator, already showed a mind that was ready to engage with antiquity in a very innovative and new way. He was well groomed for the task. He was born in 1454, and he was nephew to Pope Sixtus IV. He joined the Franciscan order in his uncle's footsteps, and he studied both canon and civil law at Perugia, which is, by the way, a sure sign that he was planning on becoming pope. Giuliano served as the right hand to Sixtus on his many, many projects to rebuild the city of Rome. Sixtus is the one who gave Rome new bridges. He gave us new aqueducts. Hospitals cropped up all over the city, together with the Capitoline Museum, which was the first time since Roman antiquity that a collection of art had been brought out to the public. As a matter of fact, the Capitoline Museums was the fruit of Sixtus's attempt to get the Romans to assist him to participate in the renewal of Rome by donating 5 bronze statues that had been kept in the Cathedral of the Lateran for over 1,000 years. He took them from the Lateran, i.e. the private space of the papal residence. He put them in the Conservator's Palace. He opened it up to the public. And so Julius was part of that project. The other thing he did, of course, was to build the Sistine Chapel. And in doing that, he brought in a series of the greatest 15th century painters, who I always tend to dub the dream team of Florentine art. And as the executor of this project, Julius ended up getting to know and being in contact with the greatest painters of the 15th century. This is his portrait done by Melozzo da Forlì, and over here you see his portrait done by Botticelli. And so he learned an awful lot about the power of art in order to uplift his people and to really open the spirit. So, this conclave of 1503 that was so fast was because they were looking for a reformer. And Julius was elected literally on a platform of reform. 2 of his earliest acts were very telling about how he was planning on going about this reform. On one hand, he immediately moved out of the old papal apartments. The apartments had belonged to Alexander VI Borgia, his predecessor, and they were extremely ornate, very luxurious, and of course there were some problematic portraits of some uncomfortable members of the family. So he decided to distance himself, just physically to begin with from those apartments, and he brought in Bramante, the great architect, to start building a second set of apartments directly on top of the old ones. The second thing was a little bit more interesting. He had to make a decision about what to do with his art collection. He had spent 14 years as an art collecting cardinal. He'd spent another 20 years as an art collecting archbishop cardinal traveling around Europe. And now he was sitting on what was probably one of the greatest private collections in the world. The custom was that you would give a collection like that to your family members. So you can imagine the various nephews and cousins that are angling around waiting to create a dynastic collection. That's where the Farnese collection comes from. That's where the Medici collection comes from. Unfortunately, it appears that Julius didn't like his family very much. And so he started to look around for an alternative. And the alternative was to house his collection in a little house that was sitting on top of the hill next to the Vatican palaces, what was then known as the Palazzetto Belvedere, the little Belvedere palace sitting on the top of a hill. It had been originally built in 1486. It was built as a recreational space, a space to pray, a space to meditate. But he took that little palace, he filled it with his old beloveds and his new acquisitions, and he formed the nucleus of the Vatican Museums with a truly visionary and astonishing gift. And so the collection it was a peaceful place for meditation, and in this space he would be able to meditate quietly. He gave perhaps his most beloved work. This is probably the most remarkable sign of the personal generosity of Julius II. His favorite work that was already his as a cardinal was the Apollo Belvedere. And the Apollo Belvedere left his palace and came to join the Vatican collection. And Apollo would be the supervisor, almost as if that statue would be watching over the regrowth of the arts, the regrowth of beauty in the Renaissance and with the collected people. In that space, artists would mingle with poets, who would mingle with philosophers, who would mingle with theologians. The Medicis had already created something somewhat similar. And as a matter of fact, Michelangelo was trained, or in a certain sense formed, in a similar garden belonging to Lorenzo the Magnificent. But in the case of Julius II, he had bigger plans. It would be in that space that Michelangelo would be able to engage with ancient art so as to be able to produce the designs for the Sistine Chapel. And in that space, a Raphael would learn to fuse monumentality with that magnificent elegance that is such a trademark of his art. So the core of his garden, now known as the octagonal court, it boasted orange trees, like the background of Botticelli's Primavera. It would have had 4 fountains, so when you went in there, there was just the sound of running water. There were cool breezes, and the statues were placed around the space as if they were amusing themselves in their own personal garden of the Hesperides. So the idea in Julius's almost enchanted imagination is that he's putting together this garden and the gods happen to drop by. So Apollo is walking along and he happens across the sleeping Cleopatra, as she was known at the time, and Hercules will flex and Venus flirts, and it's as if you're intruding in a certain sense on this special space where the gods go to play. In this space, you would find all the possibilities for artists to be able to springboard into great art. They'd be able to think of new designs, and they'd be able to engage comfortably, easily, and regularly with the high bar of the great art of the ancient world. Now, to the unprepared visitor, that space would have seemed awfully strange. Pagan gods frolicking around in the Pope's house. And so the question would occur to someone, what are these heathen idols doing in this sacred place? And antiquity, Julius understood antiquity at a certain point simply became impossible to ignore. Like, how many times could he possibly walk through Rome and just pretend the Colosseum wasn't towering above them, or that the Pantheon wasn't dwarfing the little hovels that were clustered up against it? Antiquity was just part of the history of Rome. Now it was time not to look at it as a fearful vestige of a corrupt pagan culture, but as a fertile soil from whence a new art, a new caput mundi of Christendom would be able to arise. And so, if Alexander had been the new Nero, Julius set out to be the new Augustus, and he would bring peace, prosperity, and beauty to Christendom. However, he was quite aware of the avant-garde nature of his artistic program, and so he put on the entrance to his building, Procul este profani, which is the line from Virgil's Aeneid, when the Cumean Sibyl says, away, away you profane eyes, away with you profane. And so those, the uninitiated. So it was a place that was really for the initiated. It was a place for artists, it was a place for thinkers, writers, humanists, but it had a very specific audience. This inscription does reveal the nature of the Catholic imagination of this Renaissance. It was flirting with idols of old, drawing on beauty once used to persecute the Christian community. Venus, Apollo, Hercules are all deities who once demanded worship, but now they claim a new kind of attention. The beauty of the ancient world was closed upon itself, it was focused upon itself, and it could only worship itself. However, Apollo, with his perfect proportions and his beautiful articulation of his limbs and body, he's He can only be worshipped, but he can never be emulated. But the Catholic imagination of that age, unleashed in that space thanks to the sponsorship of Julius the Second, allowed Michelangelo to look at that body and transform it into the poignant, vulnerable, lifeless body of Christ. So this imagination that can see these figures, devoid them of their pagan content, and reuse that beauty to speak in a profoundly important and deeply Christian context. The centerpiece of the Catholic effort to redeem ancient art is the statue of Laocoon. This work, described by Pliny the Elder in the 1st century as surpassing anything done in painting and sculpture up to this point, was found in 1506, on January 6th of 1506. Michelangelo was present when it was rediscovered. And Julius the Second bought it for the collection just a few months later. In 2006, we celebrated the 500th anniversary of the Vatican Museums. The Vatican Museums actually considers its foundation the year that this was found and purchased for the collection. And during the many celebrations and the many speeches, there was one moment when Pope Benedict XVI singled out this work for particular attention. And he said, the magnificent sculptural group of the Laocoon, which in fact acquires its fullest and most authentic light in the Vatican context. So this work was already famous. It was already a well-known, it was famous in its own time. It had been written up as one of the greatest works in history. It was a Hellenistic image of this Trojan priest writhing in his last moments before succumbing to the sea monsters sent by Athena. It was a monument to anatomical precision, to that energetic torsion of the body and to dramatic expression. But Michelangelo, again, encouraged by this environment that allowed a complete engagement with the ancient world, took the energy of that body and he turned it into the separation of light and dark. So the imagination here looks at the body of a pagan priest dying. It's a death throe. It's the last possible moment of that Laocoon. He looks at that image of death, and Michelangelo turns it into the ultimate Judeo-Christian image of life. This enchantment, this space, which allowed these figures to take on new personalities, to become even more immortal as they went from being stones in a garden to the frescoes that people pile in to see every single day, or from a stone standing in a little niche to the Pietà where Mass was celebrated for 400 years underneath that work. And so this is this amazing imagination that he puts together. However, Benedict took this piece to underscore what he described as a truth inscribed into the genetic code of the Vatican Museums. That is, the great classical and Judeo-Christian civilizations are not in opposition to each other, but converge in one plan of God. That vision of everything being redeemable, everything in creation has the potential to contain more than just its earthly existence, permeates the entire Vatican collection. It was the imagination of a pope who could look at the fragmented vestiges of a world that had collapsed under its own hubris, decadence, refusal of the gospel, and see in it the means to recount the beauty of the incarnation. In my mind, the greatest expression of Julius's Catholic imagination is actually not the magnificent frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, nor even the famous rebuilding of St. Peter's. It's the Stanza della Segnatura, which he had painted by Raphael between 1509 and 1511. This worked as his audience chamber and his throne room. Raphael was unknown. Again, this is another story of remarkable creativity and remarkable prescience. Julius chose a basically unknown 25-year-old Raphael to paint what was essentially his Oval Office. And you all know, I mean, if you were to really think about that room, you all know the two main paintings in the room are the so-called School of Athens and the so-called Disputa, where Raphael created a conversation happening between faith and reason. This illustration of philosophy and theology. But you'll notice that those are on the sides of the room. If you've ever been there, they're on the sides of the room. Julius II sat framed by the window and two images of law. What did he look at all day long? During the long meetings, signing the long papers, during the hours on end, what's he looking at? He's looking at the image of the Christian Parnassus. And in this painting, Raphael illustrates this warrior pope. I always find it amazing that the warrior pope sat there all day long looking at the god of light, harmony, beauty, the arts. And you see how that's on top of a window, correct? Through that window, if that window were open, you can see all the way back up to the Palazzetto Belvedere, where he had just put his own Apollo. So the vision that he put together is he looks out, he's not thinking, he looks up from his table, he's not looking at the next battle plan. He's not particularly studious, so he's not looking at the next encyclical he's going to write. He's looking at the arts, and he's looking at a lineage in the arts. It even expresses his own Catholic imagination. Here you have Apollo surrounded by the 9 Muses. 4 poets get to be at the top of that hill. Those 4 poets outline the lineage of art. They're Homer, Virgil, Stazio, Dante. No Homer, no Virgil. No Virgil, no Dante. And so this magnificent lineage that takes us from the pagan inspiration all the way down to the Christian inspiration. He had illustrated, as a matter of fact, there's a lovely image directly above it, inspired by the gods. And so he had illustrated a Christian vein, this numine afflatur, which is inspired by the gods, just this very simple understanding of a sacred lineage in the arts. Now, the remaining poets, remarkable because there's the inclusion of one woman, Sappho, they continue the poetic tradition, but in a more profane fashion, because the other poets in that scene, they write poems about the cute girl who lives across the street. These are transient loves and passions. But the 3 main poets, they write about the ultimate journey. They're epic poets. They're writing about journey, and they write about journeys they write about journeys home. So in the case of Homer's Odyssey, we have Odysseus trying to go back to Ithaca. In the case of Aeneas, who loses his home, we have him finding a new home in Lazio and founding the Roman people. But in the case of Dante and all Christians, they're looking for a different home, and that home is heaven. So in a certain sense, the way I would describe Julius's dream of Parnassus is that it rested on the slopes of St. Augustine's City of God. This beautiful way of transporting the vision, these beautiful visions of the ancient world into the Christian world. However, that was a lovely, golden moment, but pretty soon the church found itself in the 16th century having to back away from that collection. The 16th century saw with the Reformation, many of those sculptures moved into the Capitoline Museum, conveniently also a papal museum, but avoiding the uncomfortable proximity of the pagan idol sitting basically in the Pope's backyard. And so there was a purge of the works. This is the period when Michelangelo's fabulous frescoes in the Last Judgment had to be covered. So this big backlash that happened in the end of the 16th century where the collection kind of became very quiet. Then in the 17th century, I'm afraid collectionism was marked by the papacies really enlarging their own family collections. Anybody who's been to Rome has seen that the Borgheses have palaces filled with art, the Barberinis, the Chigis. It was an age of personal collectionism. However, it would not take very long for art to have to come back to the service of the church as you moved into the 18th century. And in the when the Enlightenment came along, one of the great goals was to sideline the voice of the Catholic Church. There's much to recommend in the Enlightenment. However, in Rome, they could also see this sidelining of the voice of the Catholic Church. Voltaire was busy teaching people how to mock priests, how to mock the martyrs, and the secular thinkers, putting forward only the gritty mechanics of nature and its causes, were slowly depriving the world of the joyous enchantment of the eschatological soul of creation. So even the history of Rome was rewritten in this period to lay the blame on the early Christian community. Edward Gibbon came to Rome and marveled at the beauty of the ancient monuments. But as he looked at them crumbled and sunken into the ground, he did not see the result of the pride of men who worship themselves as God, but he faulted the Christians for introducing the virus that would weaken an empire too big to fail. And in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, produced in 6 volumes. He blamed a superstitious church and the early Christians, too absorbed in the hereafter, for ignoring the issues and the dangers at hand. This reading of history, evoked by the monumental ruins, bolstered by the ancient sources, and propelled by a good dose of anti-Catholicism, had found success through history from his erudite tomes all the way down to the latest Dan Brown novel. And this depressing narrative, darkness and decline, a world waiting around for a new race of men to restore it, needed mascots. And the best ones were unfortunately all locked up in the Vatican museums. And so while Gibbon had been sifting through the libraries, the papacy had been sifting through the acres of dirt and rubble, and then recouping precious physical testimonies of the past. The rediscovery of Pompeii in 1749 had propelled the papacy to explore its own lands. So Hadrian's Villa, Ostia Antica, and several spots on the Esquiline became active excavation sites. Concerned with the loss of great family collections, the early 1700s was marked by a massive economic recession. The many collections were being sold out of the country. So the church saw, on one hand, they were trying to collect more works from the excavated sites, but on the other hand, they were hemorrhaging beautiful works of art as families were selling their collections, 1720, 1728, 1730, one after the other. And so the fully aware of the new narrative of the secularists, both Clement XII and Benedict XIV had begun major rebuildings to demonstrate the modernity of Rome. So already by the mid-1700s, there's already there's already a very concerted attempt to show Rome as a very modern, forward-looking city. So these monuments that people pass by, eat ice cream on. You can no longer eat ice cream on the Spanish Steps. I'm sorry if anybody's planning that for your next vacation, but that's out. But these, it's just like swimming in the Trevi's out the window too. But the fact of the matter is that this is, these monuments were produced precisely at this moment with an eye to delighting not only pilgrims, but now the secular tourists. And so the focus of the attention of this grand tour, of course, was the massive collection of antiquities that the popes had, which had been around now for 250 years. The Belvedere Palace was a necessary stop where the literati and the curious, wealthy could wax rhapsodious of the days of old, where beauty and nobility existed hand in hand. These statues, once the inspiration of Michelangelo's Pietà and the Sistine Chapel, were now to become the poster children of a world without religion. Enter Pius VI, or Giovan Antonio Braschi, elected in February 15, 1775. He was 58 years old. He had spent many years as the exchequer to 2 popes. He had actually managed to find the money to buy several of the collections before they left the country and get them into the Vatican collections. Just as a fun fact, just in case you're curious, what he did is he instituted the state lottery. And so he made a fortune by instituting under Clement XIV, he instituted a state lottery. And that lottery, to this day, when Italy needs to make money for a particular artistic project, we still use the lottery. And so it's just kind of a cool little thing that just Pius VI trying to figure out how to get the money for it was a very clever idea. For 2 popes, he had a front row seat to the kind of the high stakes fun of collecting art, trying to find the best pieces, and also the challenges of trying to conserve art. And so he wanted to open his museum to a wider public. He was sort of moving beyond the profani. We now wanted to have more and more people coming to the museums. He was indeed governing a Rome that was more European than any other city in Italy. In Rome, you heard German, you heard French, you heard the Dane Thorvaldsen was working there. It was a very busy international mix of people. And so he had to figure out what to do with 175,000 citizens in Rome. Many many of whom were not Catholic, many of whom did not speak the same language, and had little interest in the church. And he had to enfold them somehow into this city. Oh, by the way, if that wasn't enough to recommend him, he's also the man who established the first Episcopal see in the budding United States, by the way, in Baltimore. So we owe him one too. So he imagined a place where the church's narrative of pagan past and Christian present would be told through sculpture and painting and architecture. And he embarked upon building the first modern museum. And so, with his team, including Michelangelo Simonetti, who was his architect, Giovanni Battista Visconti, who was his curator, the two of them they expanded Julius's garden by building 6 new rooms. And there were other countries thinking about building museums. The British Museum had already had a collection since 1753. So the British Museum has existed longer than the Vatican Museum, but the British Museum was really a bunch of curio cabinets with a lot of stuff in it. It was a museum that was just a collection of lots and lots and lots of things. Pius had something else in mind. It wasn't just a cabinet of curiosities, as people referred to them. What he was looking for was a space that could tell a story. He saw in the city of Rome a story that was a little different from that which Gibbon was telling. And he thought there might be a way to put together the architecture of the building, the design of the spaces, and the works themselves so as to be able to tell this narrative, to tell this story. And so he started with the Hall of the Muses. The very core and heart of the museum, of his museum, was a room referred to as the Hall of the Muses. It was right next to Julius's original octagonal court. So where Julius's court was, he built a room of the identical size, as if he's just continuing. So first of all, he builds on the work of his predecessor, building a second room. The second room would contain the muses that he had excavated at Tivoli and which he had personally donated to the collection. The first part of the museums is a tremendous example of personal generosity. Second birth of the museums, again, a tremendous example of personal generosity. He built the room, and at the time, he had the walls painted a little bit differently. The man who painted the walls, this is from another room in the Vatican, but what I'm trying to give you the idea of, it was painted with landscapes. So you would have the muses sitting again on Mount Parnassus. So later on, they painted it red in a later period of the museums. But originally, all around there had been landscapes, so it looked like a second version of Julius's garden. It also evoked the idea of Parnassus, which of course it did also at the very top, where you see Apollo and the 9 Muses and stories of inspiration, artistic inspiration from past to present. From there, he went on to build this wonderful room. It's called the Room of the Biga. It's one of my favorite rooms in the museum. It's a very small room shaped like a bathhouse. Another part of the excavations in Tivoli had recently excavated the baths with the Heliocominus. So basically, he recreated a bathhouse in the collection, and then he put in the statues of his athletes in the bathhouse, including, by the way, a brand new acquisition, which was his Discobolus. So this idea of creating plausible original settings for his works of art. So on one hand, the narrative you're following are works that are displayed in a setting that evokes their original function and purpose. This museum was to be a Catholic collection in the most Catholic sense of the word. Everybody was invited. 1784, the official dedication date, you find men, women, children, apparently even pets, which is no longer possible, by the way, at the Vatican museums. Men, women, children, and you even find, look over here in the corner, you have Muslims coming in from the Middle East, a place where everyone could be together. As a matter of fact, I just have a little note, because people always ask this question. Not as interesting as the question that started this talk. But the fig leaves you see on the statues come from this period. So the reason when we start opening up the collection and we have men and women coming to the collection together, you know, back in the day when people had sort of sensations of modesty, since you're going to have, you know, women and men standing next to each other in front of me like a naked Apollo, it was thought that it might be easier, especially on the women, to just not have, you know, unpleasant and awkward conversations. I can tell you, as someone who studied art history since I was a kid, there's a whole genre of creature that hangs around in museums waiting to catch you in front of a naked sculpture to strike up a conversation. So in order to avoid that, that's where that whole fig leafing episode of the Vatican comes from. So it's been a little bit distorted by modern literature and very funny ideas of the modern age. The most interesting time this museum was used, however, so you already see it as a place which is universal, but the most interesting use of this museum took place on January 1st. 1790 maybe, when the King Gustav III of Sweden came to, 1784, King Gustav III of Sweden came to Rome. Now he's a Protestant king of a Protestant country where he's the head of his religion. And the Pope is the head of his religion, and relations are not great. So they can't have an official meeting. They can't go and have like a meeting in the Pope's offices. They need a place where they can run into each other and just have a conversation. What was that place? It was the collection of Pius VI. It was perfect for that. Because, okay, fine, they can't talk about religion. They apparently can't talk about politics, but they can stand side by side and talk about art and beauty. And I can tell you, this is what got me through the 2016 election, just so you know. I just put people in front of Apollo and said, let's talk about that. And this painting done by Biga Guénérot, this is my favorite part of it. So in the midst of, this is Pius VI being tour guide. So I find myself in exalted company. Pius VI is busy being tour guide to King Gustav III of Sweden. Over here, please note, someone is posing in the exact same position as his favorite deity. So it's a great piece of painting. And then here's the larger version. This is the cool part, and this is something that's actually quite fascinating about the museums. Do you know who were all recruited to be tour guides in that period? They were all the cardinals. And if you look at the grouping, see them here? These are all the clerics that are sitting around having little side tours in the corner. They were tremendously knowledgeable about the collection. They understood the provenance. It was always amazing to these people to come in and find how much the clerics knew, how much they had in common in this love of antiquity. So this really became, it was designed in part to be an instrument of dialogue. And so the museum demonstrated a clear understanding of the historical, artistic, and literary context of its sculptures. It reclaimed that long-standing love of history, which had only recently been discovered by the Enlightenment. And so not only did they have the collections, but they developed archaeological journals. There was also the library expanded regarding art. So this is a scientific understanding, not just an aesthetic passion that we're dealing with. And in this wonderful painting, which was actually for the predecessor of Pius VI. This is this wonderful illustration of how the historical narrative in the Catholic imagination functioned in the Museum of Pius VI. This is Cleo. She's the muse of history, and she's writing history on the back of time. So she's Cleo the muse. Here's the back of time, and the figure, the two-faced figure, is history. So history is looking with the younger face because we learn from it in the modern era, but we look back into the past, and it's a single figure because history brings past and present together, which is you'll see in a second, particularly Catholic as a concept. You have the little poet coming up in the side. History helps to fuel the arts. You have the statue in the background. History helps to fuel not poetry, but also sculpture. And then you have the little fame figure, which is pointing at the Pope's museum because it's a shout out. And then here is the bigger framework of this painting. You have history, you have the ancient works, but who is here and who is there? Peter and Moses. This is a larger narrative. This little blip of Roman history, the blip of the Roman Empire, or even the great Greek classical era, that little blip is part of a big, beautiful picture, which is the story of salvation, which is anchored by Moses. It's anchored by Peter, who brings us into the present. So that same Janus figure you see in the middle of the painting, the old looking backwards, Old Testament, the new looking forward, New Testament. The museums, that collection of the museums opens up not just to a narrative of what the Greeks and the Romans did, but how that beauty, how everything they did was part of a larger picture of the story of salvation. And the centerpiece of this whole collection was the entrance. So to really draw out and to bring up, to hold up his idea of what the overarching narrative should be is he designed a brand new entrance. And Simonetti designed 2 rooms to form the entrance. The first room, you're seeing the entrance as you were supposed to come up. When you first entered the museums, you came up through this room with the Croce Greca, and you looked in the background, and once upon a time there was a figure of a muse, although today now we have the giant bronze Hercules. But you came into this museum, you walked into this temple, and your first impression is, yes, I'm coming for inspiration. I'm coming to look at the beauty of old. You walked through these rooms, you came into the showpiece of the collection, the room of the Sala Rotonda. The Sala Rotonda, based on the Pantheon, Temple of Minerva Medica, a beautiful space evoking the greatest of the pagan temples, in which he put his largest god statues. So the giant muse stood on one end. The rest are gods and goddesses standing inside a pantheon. So on one hand, you get a sense of what it was like to be in the pantheon, but on the other hand, it also gives you a very plausible arrangement for where these works once would have had their most powerful voice. From there, you walked, this is what it looks like today with people. From there, you walked into the room of the Muses, and you could see beyond the room of the Muses the light of the garden of Julius the Second, the core, the nucleus, the heart of this collection. You went and you looked at the very first time, 250 years earlier, when the popes first began to collect these magnificent works. And then as you turned back, this sort of glorious beauty, sort of drunk on this glorious beauty, you came back and you headed out back towards the Sala Rotonda. This time, who's waiting for you on the other side of the Sala Rotonda? It's that Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar is represented there as a, god. So all of a sudden, there's kind of that little, that uncomfortable itch in the back of your head. Wait a minute. Wait a hold it. Isn't that like a pagan temple, like the Pantheon, which is where the Romans worshipped God? Wasn't Julius Caesar the first man to become a god? And by the way, that big purple bowl in the middle there, didn't that belong to the guy who killed St. Peter and St. Paul? And so somewhere in there, this little troubling question begins to arise, which is, what is the Pope doing with these things that belong to the vestiges of this world that was so hostile to Christianity, catering to a whole bunch of people who are all set to be hostile to Christianity? What is the matter with you, they ask. And the answer to that question was, when you're walking out, it's again in that room of the Croce Greca. What unites those 2 rooms is the use of this purple stone. This porphyry stone, this purple granite here, which is part of the bowl of Nero, is a very rare stone. It could only be used for emperors. So that stone, that bowl, which had been moved around, was always associated with the emperor. Nero had been found in his golden house. These 2 boxes to the left and the right of the entrance, inside the room of the Greek cross, are also made of porphyry. The Greek cross room, by the way, is a representation of early Christian church buildings. So where you have the Pantheon, which is a pagan structure, the Greek cross is associated more with Christians. And these are the 2 sarcophagi. They happen to be of empresses because they had to be of that stone, but they're not any old empresses. those empresses are also saints. You're looking at the sarcophagus of Saint Helena, the mother of Constantine, the woman who nagged Constantine into tolerating Christians and found the cross that Jesus was crucified on. And this is Constantina, his daughter, who around 350, she converted to Christianity, the first member of the imperial family to openly convert to Christianity. Her conversion heralded the conversion of the rest of the empire, which happened 30 years later. And so what is the story he's telling us? He's got another narrative, Pius VI. He lays into place an alternative narrative to Edward Gibbon's. How about a story of a Roman Empire that spent 300 years trying to get the Christians to worship their gods, killing their leaders, trying to make them worship men who become gods? But after 300 years, what happened in Rome? The Romans became Christian. For Pius, what made this collection amazing, what makes the story of this art and this beauty amazing, it's the story of the impossible conversion. I don't know if you would have put money on Peter and Paul if you ran into them coming to Rome on the boat, right? And yet, the perseverance of Peter and Paul and the martyrs brought about the conversion of Rome. So this storytelling, this imagination to look at the history of Rome, look at the history of Greece, look at the history of beauty, look at the history of Christianity, and see in it a divine plan to bring those Romans to the true God. However, all good things must come to an end. So within 10 years of having built his museum, the French Revolution happened. And they took, almost everything. They took, under the Treaty of Tolentino in 1797, they took 100 works. That apparently was not enough because they also took Pius VI. Pius VI was arrested in 1798. He was 80. He was put into a carriage and he was trundled around Europe until he finally died in the south of France in Valence in 1799 to the famous newspaper heading, Pius the Last. Spoiler alert, the next pope's name is Pius VII. But the fact is that the works that they took, this is an etching from a float they made, but they made a whole sort of float of a triumphal parade. But if you take a look at what they took, you'll recognize Apollo being brought through the streets of Paris, and you'll even see the Laocoon, which makes its way to Paris along with Raphael's Transfiguration and a whole bunch of other paintings, so a bunch of other sculptures. And so the fact of the matter is that the collection was severely looted and damaged. It is true that it didn't dampen the ardor of his successor, Pius VII. He managed to purchase a few more collections. He restored the Colosseum. He also, by the way, again, cool things popes do. He got these works back. He's the one who basically created the basis of art recovery law when he went to argue after the fall of Napoleon that the seizure of the Vatican works had been illegal. However, all that aside, it was very obvious, the writing was on the wall, that the prestige and the importance and the space and the commanding presence of the Papal States was diminishing every day. They certainly didn't look the same in 1815 than they had at the time of Pius VI, and they were getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The unification of Italy saw that eventually it was very clear to the papacy that it was only a matter of time, that eventually the Rome itself would be wrested from the hands of the papacy. And for that reason, the collection in that particular period spends most of its time kind of digging around in what is still the Papal States and doesn't expand very much. However, the rising tide of Italian nationalism was unstoppable, and in 1870 the Papal States were lost, and Pius IX retreated into the walls of the Vatican, where he and his successors would have to fight the more extreme neo-Italians from wrestling that little patch of the Vatican and collections from being claimed for the newly formed Italian state. There was a little pocket of sort of radicals who wanted to see even the Vatican, even that little quarter square mile of the Vatican enter into Italy, and so every now and then there were tensions about whether or not The collections would simply be subsumed by Italy. However, the turning point came in 1922. This is a little bit of this is the election of Pius XI, because after 3 years of 3 papal elections, they all took place where the smoke came out the Sistine Chapel, but the Pope did not come to the front balcony of St. Peter's. Part of the protest after the unification of Italy and the, if you will, exile of the papacy into the Vatican City State is they did not come to the window until Pius XI, who came to the window on the day of his election, and already showed an openness and a willingness to begin to engage with the Italian community, with the Italian community and with the world. And so Pius XI's vision was a vision of a global community. His imagination is an imagination that looks at community, bringing people together, trying to figure out how to bring geographically, ideologically, culturally distant people together. His world had seen the rise of communism, it's seen pacifism, it's seen the United States flex its muscles, it had seen the new technologies. As a matter of fact, he was the first pope to have his election televised or videoed, as it were, and he was the first pope to use the radio. So he had Guglielmo Marconi build Vatican Radio in 1931. He addressed his ever-expanding flock, listen and hear, O peoples of distant lands, to the city and to the world. And with that, we understand Pius XI, a man who was interested in reaching out, getting beyond the barriers, and creating a community. He would make peace with the newly formed Italian state with the Lateran treaties in 1929. He would see the Via della Conciliazione arrive right at the doorstep of St. Peter's Basilica. For Pius, the reestablishment of a Christian community was paramount, not just in the sense of a neighborhood community in a foreign land, but a great community of diverse believers that's best exemplified in the catacombs. You go in the catacombs and what do you have? Master, slave, Greek speaker, Latin speaker, men, women, all together in one great believing community. It was Pius XI who formed the commission that still cares for those catacombs today. He was not in a position to commission art. He didn't have the deep pockets of Julius, and he was not able to administrate a state the way that Pius VI did. But he did find a way to use the museums to reflect his particular form of Catholic imagination. So he faced the challenges of the art world that was passing the old narrative and figurative canvases by, lovingly amassing the old-fashioned paintings in his picture gallery to await kinder days. Then he set about creating a new collection, completely different from that of any of his predecessors. He began in the holy year of 1925, when he opened up in the Vatican Gardens 24 pavilions with 100,000 objects that had been brought from missionaries and lay workers and people who worked for the church all over the world. It was a chance for, even though the Vatican had now been reduced to this tiny little patch of land, it was a way for people to come into those walls and see that despite the diminished geography, the mission of the church was global than anything that anybody had seen before. The only experience of global people had known in the earliest 20th century was a world war. And he showed a global effort where all over the world missionaries were caring for people, evangelizing people, but also taking care of and respecting their arts and traditions. This little statue of a deity, two, from French Polynesia, is very, very rare. Because when the French colonialists took over French Polynesia, they destroyed almost all of them. But the missionaries had these that came to the Vatican, and for that reason, this one survived. This is art that not only in some cases conserved very rare artifacts. As a matter of fact, there are always people coming to the Vatican museums. It's actually fascinating with our missionary ethnological museum. There are always people coming, because it turns out we have the world's we have the rarest, we have wampum belts that nobody has. It turns out in our 800,000 objects in that collection, we have We have quite a few things that really, thanks to these missionaries, conserving them, taking them, and bringing them, we have them, and others are gone. Another interesting thing it shows is how people struggle. It reminds us a little bit of the early struggle that the Greeks and the Romans had to understand Christianity, looking at the struggle that people have in even a more modern era. This crucifix with a polar bear on it, this idea, everything that the polar bear means, and renewal and in a certain sense resurrection among the Inuits. How different is it from when the Christians first put the face of Apollo on the Good Shepherd to try to explain to the Greeks and the Romans that this was a man who was going to take away your burden of sin? So this understanding and this empathy towards people as they struggle towards finding a way to understand Christian truth within their own framework. But again, his great legacy was an entrance. And he began a new entrance for not a few initiated, not for the grand tour, but he was the man who understood with steamboats, with the beginning of flight, we would begin to see people from everywhere. And so he built a brand new, he constructed a brand new entrance in 1932, our very famous double helix entrance. There he is looking it over. This is the inauguration of the entrance on December 7th of 1932, and this is what it looks like. And up until the 20th century, up until 2000, this was the way visitors were greeted as they came to the museums, climbing up this ramp, that in a world where, for example, the futurists were working at the time of Pius XI, and they're about dynamism and the machine and going forward. And he presented an entry into a museum which was a slow rise, this contemplative winding as you move your way up towards light. And all the way around, decorating that spiral, what is there? The genealogy of the papacy, the years and years and years of the superheroes and the visionaries like Julius, like Pius, who managed to make huge steps, but even the popes who just took care of the collection, fixed things, changed things, altered things over the course of the years. The genealogy of the love and care that the pontiffs have spent on this museum. And so this is, today the museum has new challenges to face, of course. The engagement with the modern era of art, which doesn't see beauty and revelation as hand in hand. So we've gone a bit from proculeste profani to basically here comes everybody. There are practical problems of 6.2 million visitors a year. The new entrance opened by John Paul II in 2000, and the expanded didactic staff under Pope Benedict has done a lot to welcome the millions of visitors who share an ever-diminishing common knowledge base. So no longer do people come armed with the Bible or their knowledge of the Iliad and the Odyssey. They tend to be more armed with Pokemon Go or a TripAdvisor rating. And that's what gathers people together. And so that's just about that. That's just stimulus for the Catholic imagination to get to work. As John Paul II said when he inaugurated the new entrance in 2000, today thousands come every day from every social and cultural class and from every part of the world. One can truly say that the museums at the cultural level are one of the most significant doors that the Holy See opens to the world. So, after the gold of the artistic genius, the myrrh to anoint and sanctify the past, and frankincense for diffusing beauty through the world, one wonders what gifts the next generation of Magi will bestow to awaken and delight the Catholic imagination in the millions of visitors who come every day with one thing in common. They are all still looking for enchantment and grace. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions. If you all have questions, please come to the microphone, and Liz will answer your question.
Oh, wow, you're ready.
My name is Sydney. Thank you so much for coming. That was incredible. So I just had a couple questions. I just finished learning about Martin Luther's 95 Theses in one of our core classes. And we were made aware of the lack of pastors taking care of their parishes. them spending time in palaces, looking at art, buying art. How were the pastors during this time taking care of their parishes? Were they trying to balance appreciating art and their parishes?
I would put it this way. Julius the Second is the last pope before the Reformation. And so Julius the Second was intended, he was supposed to reform the church. That was exactly his mandate. Julius then found out that he got a little distracted with his art collection. This was something that was very widespread. Therefore, when the Council of Trent had to address the issues that were brought about in the Reformation, one of the things the Council of Trent was very, very, very intent on was the need for parish pastors, bishops to be in their space. I am afraid that I left out the part about how Julius managed to put together the money for his collection, which is not indulgences, it's probably worse, sale of church jobs. So he came into fairly empty coffers, and I'm afraid that the sale of work, not entirely unknown in Italy even today, the sale of work was actually one of the major ways that he funded the collection. So on one hand, he was supposed to, he thought more in terms of repairing the image of the church, and far less instead of thinking in terms of repairing the issues of the church.
Beautiful, thank you.
Thank you for that amazing talk. I hail from the country of the Cabinet of Curiosities. So it's nice to see there was a priority there.
I had a great picture of the stuffed giraffes. I figured I'd get everyone distracted, though.
Okay, very good. The stuffed giraffes are important, though. But anyway, so I was wondering about your fascinating point about the use of the body and the use of, in the Renaissance, of classical form into the Pieta and so forth. And I was just wondering if there's any evidence, maybe in the slightly earlier period as well, in the amazing transition from, say, the International Gothic to the heroic, in Masaccio or so forth, that I've always wondered if there was, or in Da Vinci, is there any evidence about a newfound appreciation for materiality and the incarnation, and that there's something else happening as part of or distinct from the embrace of the classical inheritance?
That's my favorite question. Unfortunately, that's like a whole talk, because that's a whole course of study.
Could you give that talk?
I'll try it in 2 words. Saint Francis. Saint Francis really does. He's one of the key figures in changing the. And Dominic, I see you two looking at me. But Francis's embrace of nature, Francis's ability to dominate his human nature and to turn it into his own conversion story, his own very visible physical way of engaging in the world, not just in the sense of the nature around him, but even his own nature. It opens up a door where, instead of looking as the natural and human nature as something that is problematic, that will lead you astray, is something beautiful. Why? Because there's a whole change in them, there's a whole shift in the thought of Jesus's experience. Jesus's experience as a man on earth is something that, when Francis makes people think deeply about it, it all of a sudden raises up all of creation, particularly human beings. You'll see the change happen already in the representation of crucifixes. You'll see the change happen in the way that the Christ child is figured. You'll see a change happening already in 1200. Michelangelo comes along very, very, very late in the game, and that's why he can be so confident. His attitude towards ancient art, no fear, they're there to work for him. He's not even cowed by it anymore. But that's the fruit of 300 years by the time he gets along. It's a wonderful topic. The Life of St. Francis, in G.K. Chesterton's Life of St. Francis, a whole discussion of nature, which is beautiful. And Henry Thode wrote a book which nobody ever bothered to translate because they hated the thesis, but he's the one who wrote the thesis that Francis is behind the Renaissance. So.
It's a wonderful talk. I was, sorry, over here. I'm very interested in, I really liked how you laid out how the church basically baptized pagan art and brought it into the church, used it as using it to tell the tale of the church, really. What I'd like to ask you about is, how do we compare that to the modern museum, which takes church art and desacralizes it, sort of brings it in just for its pure aestheticism? I mean, because you lay out that the church is trying to tell a story. When we go to the Met in New York and we see these wonderful altar pieces, they're just hanging on the wall. They fit into a period, but what I wonder if you had any comments.
So basically, it becomes very sterile when you take a work about art. You take a work about out of its place as its liturgical function. You take it out of its place as something that's meant to be devotional. I will say that the Detroit Institute of the Arts, and part of a larger program, however, the Detroit Institute of the Arts did really groundbreaking work. Rambiel did groundbreaking work in thinking in terms of creating many different spaces. I mean, his religious space is sort of cryptoed into a whole bunch of others. This is what a dining room table looked like. This is what a sacred space looked like in Africa. This is what a Christian altar looked like. But that he discovered when they did all this research that people understand and they like works of art better if you put them in that kind of context. So just because, I mean, it's really become sort of a question of beginning to sort of create a sort of an alternative or find museums that have an alternative. So for example, Monsignor Verdon, who will be here tomorrow, Monsignor Verdon's museum, what he's done with that museum has really created a space where you walk into you see the cathedral as it was originally supposed to be designed, and it's incredibly successful. So just keep putting models out there, and you'll find more people want to go see that exhibition than the Stale exhibition. I think people do want to be enchanted. They walk into the museum and they want to feel something. They just don't know what or how to feel it.
One more question. I'm lucky. Thank you again for your talk. I just wanted to ask you, you talked about the 3 Magi that will come in the future. What is your hope for, if any, for religious art as we move forward? Do you hope to see a more classical approach, or do you see a more modern approach happening? What are your thoughts?
Looking for Duncan. My hope is a rediscovery of beauty. That's what we're here for today. The incredible success of this conference is the most hopeful, wonderful thing I can imagine. I think people are ready and want to see beauty, but beauty is truth. So my hope for art moving forward is that there is more of the audiences. So we looked at the evolution of the museum, but it's also framed towards different audiences. And so you have these very sophisticated works of art, then you have a lot of art in a setting that's very didactic, and now we have art and a mix of people where many people don't really have the faintest idea of what they're looking at or how this works. So we also have to find a way. I hope that these people who come looking for something, there is a way to incite people or stimulate people to find truth and beauty as things that are compatible. And that's what I think would be a great change and revolution in art, etc.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's join. Thank you.